I'm Melissa, and I've been a doctor for almost as long as I've been Tyler's wife. We've had our ups and downs, but those 34 years went by so fast. Our home was big and cozy, always filled with life, especially when the boys, Ronald and Stephen, were young. They were like night and day, but each brought their own kind of joy into our lives. Tyler and I, both doctors, worked hard to build a comfortable life. We even bought a few apartments over the years to rent out for extra income. Life seemed to be going well until one day, Tyler came home looking unusually serious. "Melissa, we need to talk," he said, his voice heavy. He had some tests done, and the results came back it was cancer. The months that followed were filled with hospital visits, treatments, and endless waiting. Tyler fought hard, but the cancer was relentless. Watching the strongest man, I knew fade away was heartbreaking. No amount of medical training could prepare me for that. One evening, as we sat quietly in the living room, Tyler took my hand and said, "Melissa, if things don't go our way, make sure everything is sorted with the boys. The will is done, and you'll be fine financially." Not long after, he passed away. The funeral was a somber event, with family, friends, and colleagues coming from all over to pay their respects. But the hardest part was the quiet at home after everyone left. The empty spaces where Tyler used to be, his things still in place it hurt to see and remember. A few days after the funeral, I was in the kitchen, trying to figure out what to do with the leftover food, when Ronald stormed in, his face full of worry and anger. Stephen followed, looking like he wished he was anywhere else. "Mom, we need to talk about Dad's will," Ronald said, getting straight to the point as he always did. I sighed and set down the cling film. "Yes, I know," I said. "Your father left everything to me. He wanted to make sure I was taken care of." Ronald slammed his hand on the counter and said, "But what about me and Stephen? We're his sons. It's not fair that we get nothing." Stephen tried to calm things down. "Ronald, let's not rush into this. Mom's still grieving. We can figure this out without fighting." Ronald glared at him and said, "Easy for you to say. You're not thinking about the future like I am." I leaned against the counter, feeling the weight of their stares. "Your father and I built this together. He trusted me to handle things, but I hear you, Ronald. It's not my plan to leave you out. So, what then?" Ronald asked, crossing his arms and raising his voice. "We just wait until you decide it's the right time to give us our share?" "Ronald, watch your tone," I snapped, losing my patience. "I'm still your mother." Stephen stepped between us, holding up his hands like a referee. "Both of you, please. This isn't helping. Mom, maybe there's a middle ground here." I nodded, rubbing my temples. "Okay, here's what we can do. The apartment's your father, and I invested in the ones downtown." Ronald interrupted. "Yes, those." I gave him a look to quiet down and continued. "I was thinking you each take one. They're yours to live in or rent out. And from the savings, let's say $280,000 each to help you get started on whatever you need." Ronald bit his lip, clearly doing the math in his head. "And the rest? The house, the money? That stays with me for now," I said firmly. "When I'm gone, it'll come to you. These were your father's wishes." Ronald looked like he wanted to argue more, but Stephen nudged him. "Let's think about this, man. It's a fair start. Mom's not leaving us with nothing." Ronald finally nodded, though he wasn't happy about it. "Fine, but I want this in writing, Mom. No more surprises." "Of course," I agreed. "We'll get everything documented properly." As they left the kitchen, I heard Stephen quietly say to Ronald, "Give her a break, will you? She's doing her best." Ronald muttered something under his breath that I didn't catch, and honestly, I didn't want to. As I washed the dishes, I wondered if Tyler could see us and what he'd think. I hoped I was doing the right thing, but only time would tell. And time, that tricky thing, wasn't always on our side. It was a sunny afternoon, the kind that makes everything feel okay, when Ronald brought Shirley over to meet me for the first time. They hadn't been dating long, but Ronald was already head over heels. You could tell by the way he was fussing over her, which wasn't like him at all. They walked in, and right away, Shirley had this confident attitude, like she owned the place. Dressed to impress, she swept into my living room with barely a hello, her eyes quickly scanning everything. "Nice place you've got here," she said, flipping her hair back as she sat down without waiting for an invitation. Ronald was grinning like a fool beside her. I forced a smile, trying to be a good host. "Thank you, Shirley. Can I get you anything? Coffee, tea?" "Coffee sounds lovely," she replied, then turned to Ronald. "Babe, make sure it's black, no sugar." Ronald nodded and headed to the kitchen, leaving me alone with her in my own living room, feeling like the guest. The silence was awkward until she broke it. "So, Ronald tells me you're pretty well off," she said, eyeing the decor. "I'm used to a certain standard, you know. My parents made sure of that." "That's good to hear," I said, not sure what else to add. Ronald came back with the coffee and handed Shirley her cup. She took a sip and made a face. It's all right. Anyway, we've been discussing our future together, planning ahead, you know." "That's wise," I said, glancing at Ronald, hoping he'd give me some clue about where this conversation was going. Shirley set her cup down. "Yeah, and speaking of planning, we were thinking about the wedding. You know, I want something special. Ronald has probably told you I saw this place perfect for a rehearsal dinner, but it's a bit pricey. It's about $45,000. I nearly choked on my coffee. $45,000 just for the rehearsal dinner? Ronald quickly jumped in. "Mom, it's important to Christina. We want to start things off right." I put my cup down, feeling a storm brewing inside. "Look, that's a lot of money for dinner, Shirley. We need to be reasonable." Shirley's face hardened. "Reasonable? Ronald says you have the money. I don't see why we should compromise on something that important." Ronald was nodding along with her, but I could see the unease in his eyes. He knew he was asking for too much. "I'm all for celebrating," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "but $45,000 is just too much. I can't justify that." Shirley stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm not used to compromising on my standards, Melissa. I made it clear to Ronald that I expect a certain lifestyle." Ronald tried to smooth things over. "Mom, maybe we can find a middle ground." "There's no middle ground on $45,000 for a dinner, Ronald. That's final." I snapped, losing my patience. Shirley grabbed her purse and glared at me. "Fine, if that's how it's going to be, then maybe we need to rethink some things." They left soon after, and I sat there, reeling from the encounter. The nerve of that girl, coming into my home, drinking my coffee, and telling me how to spend my money. It felt like a slap in the face, a wake-up call I wasn't ready for. I was out at the grocery store when Ronald and Shirley decided to drop by again. By the time I got home, Stephen was awkwardly trying to entertain them in the living room. The atmosphere was tense, the kind that makes you want to turn around and leave, but it was my house, so I braced myself and walked in. Shirley, all dressed up as usual, handed me a list as soon as I set down my grocery bags. "Melissa, we thought a lot about the wedding gifts, and here's what we've settled on. I hope this will be easier for you to handle." I skimmed the list she handed me. It was surprisingly reasonable: kitchen appliances, some nice even a couple of pieces of furniture. "This seems quite reasonable," I said, feeling a moment of relief. "I think these are wonderful choices, really." Ronald looked at Shirley, hope crossing his face. But just as I was about to discuss where we could buy these items, Shirley's expression changed abruptly. She gasped, "Oh no, this isn't right. Give that back." She snatched the list from my hands and rummaged through her purse, pulling out another sheet of paper. "Here's the actual list." This new list was nothing like the first. It included an apartment, a luxury new car, an exclusive vacation, and even diamond jewelry. My jaw dropped. "Is this some kind of joke?" Shirley didn't flinch. "No joke, Melissa. These are the gifts we expect, only the best for our wedding." I stared at her, then at Ronald, waiting for him to say something, anything to suggest he didn't agree with this madness. But he just stood there, looking between us, clearly conflicted but silent. I couldn't hold back. "Ronald, why are you letting her do this? You know this is unreasonable." Shirley cut in, her voice rising. "This doesn't concern you, Melissa. You just need to pay up and keep quiet." That's when Stephen stood up, his face set hard. "That's enough, Shirley. You're not going to talk to our mom like that. This is her house, and you're way out of line. You need to leave, now." The room was thick with tension as Ronald and Shirley gathered their things. Shirley muttered under her breath, clearly angry. "This is ridiculous. We'll remember this." They left, and the door slammed shut behind them. I sat down, feeling the weight of what had just happened. I felt the weight of the whole situation pressing down on me. Stephen sat beside me, putting an arm around my shoulders. "We'll figure this out, Mom, but you can't let them push you into giving more than you can or should. It's not right." He was right, of course, but as I sat there with my son, I couldn't help but worry about Ronald. How had things gotten so out of hand? How could he not see what this was doing to our family? The silence between us was filled with unspoken worries and fears for the future. I knew then that this was far from over. It was only going to get harder from here. The weeks that followed were filled with constant phone calls from Ronald. Each one was more demanding than the last, his tone desperate, almost frantic. "Mom, you don't understand. I can't look poor next to Christina's family," he'd argue, his voice cracking with stress. "You have the money. Why can't you just help me out here?" I sat at the kitchen table, phone pressed to my ear, feeling a knot in my stomach. "Ronald, it's not about the money. It's about living within your means. Christina's expectations, you can't keep up with that without going into serious debt." He'd scoff, his frustration boiling over. "What do you know about it? I'm not going to live like I need more from the inheritance now. Ronald, I've offered to cover half the wedding costs, up to $130,000, and give a $7,000 gift. That's more than generous. But everything has to be agreed upon with me, no surprises." There was a pause, then a sharp laugh from him. "That's nothing. You're just being stingy. You have $1 million sitting there. Why are you holding out on me?" "Because it's not just about the money," I replied, my patience wearing thin. "It's about not feeding into this fantasy that's going to ruin you." He yelled, loud enough that I had to pull the phone away from my ear. "I don't need this. I'll handle it my way. Forget you." And just like that, the call ended. Months passed in silence. I tried to busy myself with daily routines, trying not to worry about Ronald. But the peace was short-lived. The phone rang one afternoon, and it was my sister-in-law, Rachel. "Melissa, I thought you should know." Rachel's voice was hesitant, careful. "Ronald is flying all the wedding guests to Miami Beach. He sold his apartment to fund it, and he expects you to get there on your own. He mentioned you weren't interested in helping." I hung up, a mix of anger and sorrow churning inside me. How could he be so reckless? Before I could process it all, Stephen came into the room, his expression grim. "Mom, there's something you need to hear." I recorded their conversation when they were sitting here in the living room, Stephen said as he handed me an audio recorder. I pressed play, and Ronald and Shirley's voices filled the kitchen. "Ronald, your mom is just a nasty old woman with a fat wallet. We need to squeeze as much as we can out of her, and then cut her off," Shirley said. Ronald responded in a cold, agreeable tone. "Whatever it takes, Christina. I'm not going to let her control us. If it comes down to it, I'll kick her out in her underwear." I turned off the recorder, my hands trembling. Hearing my own son speak about me like that was too much. The room spun as I tried to grasp the depth of his betrayal. Flying to Miami Beach was a decision I didn't take lightly. Stephen was by my side, both of us tense, but determined to face whatever awaited us. When we landed and approached the venue, I was shocked by the sheer luxury of it all. Flowers everywhere, lights strung like stars across the evening sky, and music in the air. As we walked into the gathering, I spotted Ronald and Shirley mingling with guests. They looked like the perfect couple, all smiles and laughter. My heart ached to see my son so lost in this fake paradise. Before I could take another step toward them, Shirley spotted us. Her smile vanished, replaced by a scowl as she marched over, her high heels clicking angrily on the stone pathway. "You shouldn't be here," she hissed, stopping just inches from me, her voice loud enough to draw attention. "This is my day, and you're not welcome." I was stunned, but before I could respond, her parents, who had overheard, came over. Her father, a tall, stern-looking man, spoke first. "Shirley, that is no way to speak to your guest, much less to Ronald's mother." His tone was harsh, a reprimand that made her cheeks flush with embarrassment. Her mother, looking equally appalled, turned to me with an apologetic smile. "Melissa, please come with us. Let's find you a place to sit." They guided us to a table at the edge of the setup, clearly an afterthought with no proper setting. The ceremony started soon after, with speeches that felt hollow given the tension in the air. Then, unexpectedly, I was handed the microphone. I stood, my legs shaky, but my resolve firm. "I came here today to wish my son and his new wife a happy future," I began, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But I also believe in honesty and integrity, something that has been sorely missing from the events leading up to this day." Shirley's face turned from pink to red, her eyes glaring daggers at me. I was asked for money time and again in amounts that no reasonable person would find justifiable. I continued, my words hanging in the air like a final judgment. When I couldn't meet their demands, I was threatened with being cut off from my family and future grandchildren. My voice cracked a bit, but I kept going. Seeing my distress, Stephen stepped closer and placed a supportive hand on my shoulder. I nodded at him and then played the audio recording he had made. Shirley's voice filled the air, cold and calculating, as she talked about how they would squeeze more money out of me. Ronald's voice agreed, saying he was ready to leave me with nothing for the sake of his bride. The crowd murmured, shocked and disapproving. I turned off the recorder, and the silence was heavy. I gave my son an apartment and $35,000, but it was never enough, I said. Today, I'm making it clear. I won't be treated like an ATM or threatened anymore. I'm done with Ronald and Shirley. I wish them well, but from this day forward, I'm choosing to remove myself from their lives. The reaction was immediate. Shirley screamed, her voice shrill and wild. "You've ruined my wedding. I curse you." After everything that had happened, coming back home was bittersweet. In the quiet, I made a decision that even surprised me. I quit my job. I had spent years healing others as a doctor, but now it was time to heal myself and rebuild the life that recent events had scattered. Stephen, bless his heart, had just graduated from art college and was full of ideas and ambition. With the $35,000 I had given him, he opened his own tattoo parlor. It wasn't just any shop, it quickly became a place where art and skin came together in stunning displays. Stephen poured his soul into his work, and it paid off. He started entering tattoo contests, and soon his name was on everyone's lips in the area. Before we knew it, he was opening more locations, creating a network of salons that became a hotspot for tattoo enthusiasts. I'd watch him sketch late into the night, his dedication a stark contrast to the chaos his brother had chosen. "You're doing amazing, Ollie," I'd say, pride swelling in my chest. During these calm months, Ronald reappeared. One afternoon, he showed up at the door, his eyes tired, his shoulders slumped, so different from the ambitious, sharp man he once was. "Mom, I need to talk," he said, not waiting for an invitation to sit. His voice was weary, a far cry from the demanding tone I had gotten used to. I sighed, motioning for him to continue. "What is it, Ronald?" "It's Christina," he said. "She's driving me insane. She wants more and more. Nothing's ever enough. I got a second job, but it's still not enough for her." His words were desperate, but they couldn't erase the past so easily. "Ronald, I warned you," I said. "I told you that living like that, with someone like her, is unsustainable." He rubbed his face, frustration clear. I know you did," Ronald said, his voice trailing off, hopelessness replacing any explanation. "Thought what? That money would just appear, because you wanted it to?" My tone was harsh, years of built-up frustration making it hard to soften. "Look at your brother. He started with the same amount and made something of himself without stepping on others." Ronald bristled. "Yeah, well, not everyone's like Stephen, are they? I have rights to the inheritance too, remember? And when you're gone, it'll come to me." That was the last straw. "Get out, Ronald," I said, my voice cold and firm. "And don't come back, not this time. You chose your path." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue more. But then he turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. As I stood in the silence that followed, Stephen came downstairs, having heard the last part of our exchange. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked. I nodded, wrapping my arms around him. "I am now, thanks to you. Let's just focus on the good we can do and the life we can build." He hugged me back, his presence a comforting assurance that not all was lost. In that moment, I knew that despite the heartaches, the journey was still worth it. We had each other, and that was enough to keep moving forward. After the storm with Ronald had passed, our home settled into a calm I hadn't felt in years. It was during this quiet time that Stephen brought someone special home. Her name was Nicole, and she was everything Shirley wasn't: kind, humble, and genuinely caring. As the weeks turned into months, their relationship grew stronger, and soon they announced their engagement. The wedding, unlike the extravagant affair that was Ronald's, was a simple, heartfelt ceremony in our backyard. Flowers from the garden, homemade decorations, and a small group of close friends and family made the day perfect. During the reception, I pulled Stephen aside. "You've chosen a wonderful woman," I said, my voice thick with emotion. He squeezed my hand. "I learned from the best," he replied, giving me a knowing look. Life moved quickly after that. They sold the apartment I had given Stephen and, with a bit of their savings, bought a small, cozy house just a few miles away. One sunny afternoon, while we were having tea in their new living room, Nicole shared some news. "Melissa, we're expecting twins," she announced, her eyes shining with excitement. I almost dropped my cup, overwhelmed with joy. "Twins? Oh my goodness, that's wonderful." Stephen beamed with pride. "We wanted you to be the first to know. We're really happy, Mom." "Twins," I repeated, letting the words sink in. Grandchildren, it was a new chapter, one I was eager to begin. As for Ronald, news from him was scarce. The last I heard, he had divorced Shirley. She had taken nearly everything in the split, leaving him to start over in another city. Despite the pain he had caused, it hurt to know he was out there somewhere, struggling because of his choices. One evening, as I sat looking through old photo albums, Stephen came and sat beside me. He noticed a picture of Ronald and me from years ago. "Do you ever hear from him?" he asked softly. I shook my head. "No. After everything, he's chosen his path, and I have to respect that, even if it breaks my heart." Stephen put an arm around me. "He's still my brother, Mom. Maybe one day he'll come around." "Maybe," I agreed, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "But for now, we have plenty to keep us busy, especially with those twins on the way." Stephen chuckled. "Yeah, you're about to be the busiest grandma in town." We both laughed, the sound filling the room with warmth. Despite the past, despite the mistakes and heartaches, this moment here with Stephen felt like everything was exactly as it should be. Life was moving on, and so were we, with new hopes and dreams just on the horizon.